I'm very, very happy that this motion has passed, and I'm really looking forward to the study now being conducted by the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage.
What do you think about the Prime Minister not being here for this vote and instead choosing to campaign? What does that tell you about your leader decides to skip a very important vote?
I'm really looking forward to this study being conducted by the Canadian Heritage Committee. It'll be a great time.
Do you ever think that you could have allayed the Conservatives' concerns by putting a definition of Islamophobia between a couple of commas in that motion?
I'm really looking forward to the committee making that conclusion.
But you haven't answered my question. Do you ever think you could have allayed their concerns by just...
I don't think so, no.
Why not?
Any more questions?
Why don't you answer my question?
I'm interested in that answer.
Yeah, we want to know that. What was your question?
So why wouldn't you have felt that you could have allayed their concerns by just putting a definition in the text of the motion? Put it between a couple of commas?
You know, it was a really collaborative effort amongst all Canadians and amongst all parliamentarians, and I was not able to find consensus. And like I've said before,
in the text of the motion.
I think I've said before as well that you know, a lot of grassroots organizations came forward, a lot of MPs came forward and consulted with me on this motion and really changing the words of the motion, to which so many Canadians and members of Parliament were standing for. It just didn't make any sense. So I'm really happy that the vote today has shown positive support for this motion, and I'm really looking forward to the committee taking on this study.
Now that is the beauty of freedom of speech. You can let a person speak and let their own actions and words be the judge of them. And what Iqra Khalid did was destroy herself by trying to avoid answering the basic questions that many Canadians question about Motion 103. Motion M103 was tabled by Iqra Khalid, a member of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party. It states the government must condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systematic racism and religious discrimination. Was taken to vote on Thursday, March the 23rd, where a total of 201 MPs voted for it and only 91 voted against it. Here is the official text of the motion. In the opinion of the House, the government should recognize the need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear, and condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systematic racism and religious discrimination, and take note of the House and Commons Petition E-411 and the issue raised by it, and request that the Standing Committee of the Canadian Heritage undertake a study on how the government develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systematic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, in Canada, while ensuring a community-centered focus with a holistic response through evidence-based policy making, collect data to contextualize hate crime reports, and to conduct needs assessments for impact communities, and that the committee should present its findings and recommendations to the House no later than 240 calendar days from the adoption of this motion, provided in its report. The committee should make recommendations that the government may use to better reflect the enshrined rights and freedoms in the Constitutional Act, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The text of Motion M103 is so vague, to the point it groups actual racists hating Muslims and valid critics of the religion of Islam in the same boat. The text also does not clearly define what constitutes as Islamophobia. That is why so many people are worried about its implementation and further laws like this in the future. If we dive deeper into this motion, we could find that Motion M103 poorly implemented its choice of words. If we look at language itself, a single word can have multiple different meanings. This leads to an important philosopher of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Born in 1889 and died in 1951, Ludwig was a major contributor to conversations on language, logic, metaphysics, and ethics. He published two important books, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus in 1921 and the Philosophical Investigations in 1951, in which he's best known for. I will be focusing on his second book, because Wittgenstein had a shift in views in language in his later life. In his second book, Investigations, Wittgenstein explained that words are not a solid structure, but are more of a fluid structure that is bound to our everyday practices and form of life. Creating statements with meaning is not a matter of mapping the logical form of the world. It is a matter of being aware that language has definite limits. We must be aware of these limits. Wittgenstein claimed that in most cases the meaning of a word is how it is used. One of the most famous parts from the book Investigations is it ain't what you say, it is the way you say it, and the context in which you say it. Words are how you use them. Wittgenstein's advice for people in the active debate was to make sure both parties were perfectly clear that they were using terms in the original defined context, and not in the non-standard way, because if terms were taken out of context, words can mean anything and nothing. So what does this have to do with Motion M103? Well, if we look at the word Islamophobia, it is defined as dislike or prejudice against Islam or Muslims, especially as a political force. Now typically this is what the government of Canada deems as the proper definition of Islamophobia. Now to me and a lot of other people, that does not fit the meaning of Islamophobia. If we break down the word Islamophobia to Islam, a religion and belief, and phobia, persistent irrational fear of a specific object, activity, or situation that leads to a compelling desire to avoid it. That would mean that in the context of this definition of Islamophobia, the fear of the religion of Islam is justified, because fear is the appropriate response to a religion that is bound by Sharia law, that is against women's rights and throwing gay people off buildings. And it shouldn't be strange to not want that to come to Canada. Since both of these definitions of Islamophobia are different, it becomes apparent that Islamophobia is too vague in what it actually means. Therefore, if we look at the text of the motion, in where it states, to condemn Islamophobia in all forms of systematic racism and religious discrimination, it's already incorrect because of how loose the word Islamophobia is. The government of Canada is too blind to understand what the people are trying to say. We are not trying to hate on Muslims. We want the freedom to criticize a religion, because a religion is not a person, and therefore Islam should be able to be questioned for its horrible deeds against humanity. They are still oblivious in that they think racists and critics of Islam are in the same group, which shows that the government of Canada has lost touch with the people. Their definition of Islam further proves my point. The whole role of government is not to dictate how you should think and feel. The role of government is to represent the people, and they have not been fulfilling that role. And now I get that motion M103 all started because of some hate and racism towards Muslims as people, and that the government wants to make sure everyone is safe in Canada. But the problem is that they are favoring one race and religion over another, which is not equality. Equality applies to all people, not a select few. The funny thing is, this isn't the first time government have tried to control people's actions. A great example of this is the prohibition of alcohol from 1920 to 1933. But before we look into the prohibition of the 1920s, we must first look into why previous events led up to this. The anti-alcohol movement, also known as the temperance movement, was created in the early 1800s in America by ministers, physicians, and big employers that were worried about the problem of drunkards negatively ruining the community, and that drunken workers were a constant hazard. By the mid-1830s, temperance became a mass movement of the middle class. This was another age of progression, of social reform that was closely bound to such other ideas like the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. The anti-alcohol movement's main goal was to convince people that alcoholic drinks were dangerous and destructive. Temperance supporters claimed that alcohol is slowly destroying the moral character and physical and mental health of a person that drank it. Temperance supporters believed that alcohol would be comparable of how we view heroin today, as a highly addictive substance. They thought that just a moderate consumption of alcohol would still lead to addiction. The whole time, the temperance movement's idea was part fantasy. They tried to claim that alcohol was the root of all social problems at the time, such as poverty, unemployment, slums, insanity, crime, and violence. That is why they offered abstinence as the solution. In around the 1850s and up, many of the temperance supporters supported the idea of the prohibition. After the Civil War, the Prohibition Party, modeled on the Republican Party, the 19th century prohibitionists believed that the prohibition would only work if they had enough party members in office, because it would be fully enforced. In the 20th century, a new prohibition organization came to dominate the movement, the Anti-Salon League. They eventually became a powerful national organization. The League had ties all across the United States to work with churches in organizing resources for the prohibition fight. The League was allied with other temperance movements. One of them was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1916, the League supervised the election, which got the 2/3 majority that was necessary to initiate the 18th Amendment. In October 1919, Congress overrode President Wilson's veto to pass the strict prohibition enforcement known as the Volstead Act, which was based on its founder, Andrew Volstead of Minnesota, chair of the House Judiciary Committee. The Volstead Act defined as intoxicating alcohol any beverage that contained more than 0.5% alcohol. On January 16, 1920 at midnight, the 18th Amendment took place. Now keep in mind, the prohibition was not started for public health reasons. It was more of trying to create utopian-like morals, because they believed that eliminating the legal manufacturing and sale of alcoholic drinks would solve the brunt of the social and economic problems in American society at the time. So did the prohibition work? Simple answer, no. The prohibition was openly violated. New institutions began to appear, such as bootleggers and speakeasies, hip flasks, and bathtub gin. There were even prohibition agents like Eliot Ness smashing down doors. Poor quality alcohol could become poisonous and was still sold, and many of them were locked up for violating the prohibition laws. Even before the Volstead Act was passed, many were opposed to the prohibition. There was organized opposition, especially among the labor unions, but even still, the organizations were too small. In 1926, one organization, the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, or known as the AAPA, took over the campaign for repeal. At the current rate of the prohibition, it was going to be repealed sooner or later. The AAPA just accelerated the process. The funny thing is that World War I is what made for rallying popular support to pass the prohibition, yet the Great Depression provided the reason to repeal it. Just like the reasons for banning alcohol would ensure prosperity and balance to society, all the prohibition opponents had to do was to claim the same reasons for repealing it, that it would increase jobs, stimulate the economy, and reduce crime created from the lawlessness caused by the illegal liquor industry. The Great Depression played a huge part in getting the elites to stop supporting the prohibition. The prohibition likely gained support from large employers because they thought the prohibition would increase workers' discipline and productivity for companies. The mass violation of the prohibition in the 1920s and the Great Depression in the 1930s brought a new problem. Many people believed that the prohibition brought disrespect for the law, and that this lawlessness scared the rich and powerful. That is why there was increasing support for the repeal, because they thought they needed to raise public morale and show that the government was partly responsible for the Great Depression. A lot of people started to dislike the government because they thought they were getting the short end of the stick compared to the rich elites, because the law seemed to be aimed at the common workers. On March 13, 1933, just a couple days into Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, he asked Congress to modify the Volstead Act to legalize 3.2% alcoholic beer, to provide some needed tax revenue. By April 7th, beer was legal in most of the United States. So how does the prohibition of the 1920s compare to Motion M103 in Canada? It is to show that a government bill from a law or a motion can have good intentions, such as trying to fix social and economic problems by banning alcohol and trying to get rid of discrimination of Middle Eastern people in Canada. As long as a bill is horribly implemented, it doesn't matter if it has good intentions or not. It shouldn't be forced by the government. If it breaches laws protecting human freedoms, then there is obviously something wrong with the bill trying to be passed. The reason we have the government and news media calling the people opposed to Motion M103 as racist and Islamophobic is because the definitions of their choice of words does not match with their own citizens. It is also easy to call your opposition racist and sexist, to demean them as human beings. So, instead of forcing people on how to think and act, just realize that it did not go so well for the prohibition in the 1920s, as they had to backtrack, which resulted in a repeal. The same can be applied to Motion M103 and future bills passed by Trudeau's government. The government needs to realize that people of opposing opinions want the same thing as they do, to work and progress humanity down the correct path. The people of Canada and the Canadian government are supposed to be equal, in that the people have equal say and have the right to criticize their own government if they think they're going in the wrong direction. If they're not going to realize that and continue to try and babysit the people, then they are just asking to get booted out of office. This would be my take on how to solve the Motion M103 problem. I think that it needs to go, but I think there needs to be something to be done about the discrimination of different races of people, and that one race shouldn't get better treatment over all others. Do you guys and girls remember the 90s commercials that aired on TV showing the horrible effects of smoking? The thing is that they didn't force people to stop smoking. They gave the choice to the person to see if they want to continue smoking, which could lead to health problems in the future, or could stop because they see that it was a problem. The same can be said about discrimination on different races of people. Show the problem of discriminating on people based on skin color and how it affects the person receiving the racial abuse. And this would apply equally to all races of people, because no race is above anyone else. This would leave choice to the person and still would allow people to criticize their religions, especially Islam, a religion that breeds hate. Even if some races don't learn this optional teaching, it is not quite meant for them in the long run. It is to teach the next generation that racism is wrong because they are the future of humanity. Be in mind, this is my stance on the matter, for now, and I'm still open-minded to different ideas and how to fix this problem. but it would be nice to know that the government of Canada wasn't passing bills like candy. One of the problems is that they only look at feelings than looking at bills for practical reasons. You need to have a mix of both moral and practicality, and they just don't seem to be doing that now. Thanks for watching. I'm curious on what you guys think would be your idea on how to fix the motion M103 problem. Do you think it needs to be taken out, changed, stay the same, or another method to fix the problem? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.